Adam watched the alien, who stepped out of the small shuttlecraft's bay doors pensively. The woman who was currently speaking to Vrilla, who Ferry had verbally identified as Grim, seemed to be the one running whatever show they were now a part of. He stood a few feet behind Ferry when one of the other Marines inside the cabin made a small hand gesture and disembarked along with two others. He understood their movements immediately. They were moving to set up a perimeter around the craft while Grim and Ferry had a chat. Doing what any good soldier would do in his position, he fell in on the woman, who had made the hand signal, assuming her to be the one in charge during the interim conversation Grim was currently occupied by. Two of the Marines pulled off to the rear of the shuttle, taking up staggered positions about 10 meters off the rear, aiming off in opposite directions, clearly scanning the horizon for threats. He made the assumption that this is what he should mirror on the front of the craft with the Marine he was following. When he set up next to her, she turned to him, clearly confused for a moment, before realizing what he was up to. "Hey, how's stuff coming my way already?" she said with a half chuckle, turning back to her field of fire. "It just seemed like you were down a man and could use some help. Just for clarification, my field of fire is from that boulder," he said, gesturing to a jagged, oblong-shaped stone about the size of a small car, to that cut next to the dead guy. "Works for me," she said with a quick shrug, returning to her own field. "I'm Papa, by the way." "Adam," he said. "So tell me, why do they call you Papa?" I have a tendency to pop things open, explosively. First time I hit a roach tank with a landmine, the top popped right open. Hence the name," she replied, sounding half embarrassed and proud of herself at the same time. "So, explosives are your purview around these parts then?" he asked, doing his best to translate a southern accent into shill. "Damn fucking straight," she replied. "None of these other bitches have the tits to juggle 3 detonators and several pounds of composition M7 at the same time," she said, jokingly poking fun at her team. "Well," he said, reaching into his dump pouch and pulling his last brick of C4 along with his detonator out. "I guess I better pass this off to you then," he said with some mirth to his voice. In all honesty though, he knew the moments following this brief watch duty would be stressful, and they'd be made all the more stressful if they found him with 2 pounds of C4 and a radio detonator on his person. So he handed it off to Popper, who cocked her head at the brick, let out a chuckle, and put it in a large pouch that sat on her mid-left thigh. "Oh," she said, clearly grinning under her helmet. "You and I are going to get along like napalm and roaches." "Glad to hear it. When are we pulling out?" he asked the woman. "Oh, like I'd want you to pull out," she responded sarcastically, to which he only replied with a glare that she laughed at. "Juicerbrain's Grim over there forgot to turn off her comms and has been hotkeying the mic for the entire time. Judging from the conversation, I'd reckon right about now," she said, before briefly pushing her left hand up to her helmet and saying something garbled and unintelligible. Then she stood up in a hunch and pulled over behind Adam, slapping him quickly on the shoulder as she passed. Adam, taking the signal as the universal infantry code for "fall in on me," rotated, lowered his rifle to the low ready, and pulled back to the cab of the shuttle. He was the second to last soldier to enter the cramped bay of the shuttle. It had 8 seats, 4 of which were occupied. He took a seat next to Popper as the last soldier pulled into the cabin and shut the sliding door, sitting down on his other side. It was only just now that he noted the rather unusual appearance of these Marines. Instead of their helmets being the vaguely motorcycle reminiscent ones used by the regular grunts, theirs was full of angles that were vaguely reminiscent of a skull. On top of that, one and all clearly had the best in brand new Shilvanti optical gear, with various different size and shaped lenses pointed off the front of their visors. Another variation on the usual infantry was their colours. While the usual infantry all stuck with a matte black pattern with no external modification, they all had different coloured paints and patterns dotting their uniforms, with some being reminiscent of spray-on jungle and desert camouflage, such as Grim and the Marines seated to his left, ranging to what appeared to be stylised tattoos like what Popper had on her suit. Then it hit him. They were DedSec commandos, one and all, and more than likely they were Farilla's team. After his brief and mildly panic-inducing inspection of the denizens of the cabin, he finally noticed Ferry and Grim staring at him from where they sat, less than 3 away. Looking between the two of them, he noted their wildly different expressions. Ferry's pretty freckle-dotted face was twisted into a massive grin, and she looked like she might be about to vibrate out of her seat. Grim, on the other hand, was older, if he were to hazard a guess, probably early 40s with small scars dotting her deep purple face, with slightly greying hair. She was clearly a veteran of many conflicts, and was taking Adam's measure as he sat across from her. She was clearly Ferry's superior officer, and he decided to make an impression. "Is there something I can help you with, Grim?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. This seemed to take her by surprise, as her entire demeanour shifted to one that was slightly less judgmental. "Well, as non-judgmental as a Shilvanti could be to a human. Then she smiled, quirked a brow, and pulled a large rectangular datapad from where it was affixed to her ample chest. She began tapping briefly, before passing the slate to Adam. On it was thermal imaging, no doubt from orbit, of him and Ferry approaching the clearing in which he had flashbanged and properly eliminated the militia fire team, clearly sped up about 3 times its normal speed. He watched from a top-down perspective as he caught the team with their pants down, and brutally eliminated them before reuniting with Ferry. It continued playing as he looked back at Grimm. "That's Major Grimm to you, but there just so happens to be something I believe you can help with. Adam Edward McGuinness." He winced at the fact that she already knew his full name, more than likely being privy to both his human military record and some of the things he had done while operating against the Shilvanti. "As it stands right now, you've got 2 options. Option 1 is me turning you over to the military police upon our return to the Valiant Saber. We will be taken to an interior world for trial and summary execution for treason against the Empress and her subordinates. Before you decide to bite the hand that feeds you," she said, clearly noticing him bristling at the less than optimal choice, "and pick a fight with a team of Death's Head commandos, I think you want to hear the second option." She leaned forward with a knowing grin. "What I saw today from you is exactly what I'm looking for in a trench sister, or brother in your case." She pointed to the tablet in his hands, now showcasing him and Ferry's heroic last stand on the deserted mountaintop. "I happen to be down 2 podmates, who were cut down by the same rebel forces you so kindly rescued Ferry from. We know where the man behind the deaths of my 2 soldiers lays his ugly head, and I want the stiffest fucking scalp for toilet paper, so here's my offer. As of right now, I'm invoking Article 7.8, subsection D of the Empress's Special Operations Charter, and inducting a new recruit from the battlefield." She paused, and waited for Adam to respond. "So, what does this mean for me?" he asked. He was pretty sure he knew. He was about to be press-ganged into the Shilvanti military. "Short term, it means you come home with us, rearm, and go on an operation that never happened to retrieve his fucking skull. Long term, it means you get off this rock, go to selection, and then become the shadow that all who oppose the Empress fear. In other words, welcome to the team." She finished the last part with a knowing but sarcastic smile. "Well, it doesn't sound like I've got much of an option then," he said, extending a fist bump to the now very satisfied-looking Major. "Let's go take some scalps." Adam sat in the Death's Head pod bay on a Shilvanti frigate, contemplating his situation. Upon entering the ship, the commanders were whisked away to the arms locker by the ship's crew, and quickly stowed their rifles inside. It took a bit of work to make Adam and Ferry's human-made rifles fit in an arms locker designed for shill weaponry, but after a few tries they got it. He had been allowed to keep all his gear, but the shill had taken his knife and pistol from his belt, and put that in a lockbox next to the arms locker, unlike the rest of the commandos who were allowed to keep their sidearms while on vessel. He couldn't blame them, really. They were already showing him a massive amount of trust by just letting him exist in the pod bay, and not the brig. The naval soldiers that they had passed while meandering the halls had all been wary and distrusting, in addition to leering at the new male on board. He wasn't without escort, though, as the stipulation of Major Grimm, or as she needed to be addressed in public, Grimmina, had made. Popper sat in the bunk across from him, stripped from her combat armor, now clad in a sports bra and what looked like basketball shorts. She was eating some spiky green and pink-coloured fruit with a knife, carefully peeling off the spiky skin and slicing large swaths of the juicy green interior. She had offered some to him when she started, but when he tried it, he discovered it wasn't really his thing. It tasted vaguely of mango, if you describe mango to someone who has never tasted it before, then try to have them recreated in a laboratory setting. With the fruit now a desiccated green mess, she took the core of the fruit and threw it at a waste bin some 5 meters away, instead of snapping into the wall behind it with a squelch. "Fuck, Grimm's gonna kill me when she gets back," she said, rising to her feet, eliciting a chuckle from Adam. He watched the large purple alien go, muscles rippling her body as she stepped. She was the tallest in the group, at about 7'3", and was clearly the most well-muscled. She looked like she practically lived at the bench press, with triceps almost the size of Adam's head. Her skin was a mild purple, almost bordering on the dark pink, and had her hair cut in what could vaguely be described as a pixie cut, with dire streaks of green and blue running through it. Bending over to pick up the fruit and put it in the trash can, she turned and caught his eyes, noticing where his gaze had fallen. "Ha! I knew it! It's only a matter of time before I steal you away from Ferry," she said loudly, as she stood up and practically skipped back over to him. At the exact same moment, the door slid open, nearly silently, and Ferry herself entered the room. Eyeing Popper with narrowed eyes, she stood in the doorway with crossed arms. "What?" Popper asked, looking like a child who had their hand caught in the cookie jar. "The Major wants us in the briefing room in 5 minutes, in kit. Be ready for an arms draw post-briefing," she said, with some heat in her tone. Adam took this as his cue and pulled his plate carrier from where it sat beside the bunk, throwing it over his head. He quickly pulled up on the base of the carrier where his mag pouches sat, and affixed his cummerbund inside before replacing the panel. "Good to go," he said, looking at Ferry. "I'm on you." She nodded, and then continued down the hallway with him in tow. They passed through enough bulkheads and hallways to make Adam's head spin. He'd yet to get a good grasp of the layout of the ship in question, but Ferry seemed to know her way around it well enough. "Hey, we need to have that talk," he said, trying to keep his voice down so only Ferry could hear. Her pointed ears pricked up at that, and she turned her head slightly to the side, clearly trying to hide her blushing. "Did you mean it?" she asked softly. "The kiss, I mean, not the we need to talk part." He put a hand on her shoulder and stopped her from the quick pace she was walking. He pulled her until she was facing him, took her cheek in his palm and leaned up for a kiss that was both too short for them to enjoy and far too long for being in the middle of a hallway. "Yes, I did. Do you want to talk now or after the briefing?" he asked, looking at her slightly glazed over eyes. She said intelligently, clearly trying to wrap her brain around what had just happened. Then she coughed briefly, straightened, and looked back at him. "After would probably be better." Adam looked around and saw the eyes of the Shorvanti crew around them. This hall wasn't as crowded as some of the others they had passed on the way over, but a few lurkers were eyeing them, while trying their best to look busy. As a species, the Shield were not subtle, and Adam could clearly make out what appeared to be looks of jealousy, annoyance, and finally a look that he could only describe as something a wolf would make shortly after ringing a dinner bell. "Yeah," he said, noting their audience. "That would be best." With that, they continued their walk down the hallways in companionable silence, until they walked through a doorway into what was clearly the briefing room. Two other shills sat in the room, along with the Major standing at the front, next to a screen that was currently blue. One of the shill that was seated wore a mask that covered up to above her nose, while the other, significantly smaller Shorvanti commando, sat a few feet over, tapping at an omnipad. Upon seeing them enter, the Major sighed and put a hand to her forehead. "And just where, by the Empress, is Popper?" "Still getting dressed, probably," replied the diminutive Shorvanti without looking up from her slate. "You know how she is, Major. If there's a way for her to strip down half naked in front of a male, she's going to do it." Come to think about it, that's exactly what had happened. Adam had attributed her lack of clothing to her being warm, but the temperature on the ship had been constant, and everyone else here still wore their combat armor without breaking a sweat. It did explain why Ferry looked so nonplussed on entering the room. She realized that Popper was making an underhanded pass at him, before even he did. Cutting that train of thought short, Popper herself entered the room, identified Adam, and dragged him over to a row of chairs, probably sitting next to him. "Sergeant First Class Elia Fontara," the Major said, using Popper's as of now unknown name to Adam, much like a parent scolding a child. "Would you please save your antics when we aren't going over a classified mission brief?" Popper sighed dramatically, releasing her hold on Adam's shoulder as Ferry sat next to him and crossed her arms over her chest. "Fine, Grim. I'd like to lodge a formal complaint that you're a buzzkill, though," she replied sarcastically. "Duly noted, but right now I don't have the fucks to give. Our target," she said, sliding a finger over her omnipad, causing a picture of a middle-aged man of Caucasian descent to appear on screen, "has just been sighted on the outskirts of Cheyenne, Wyoming. It's believed that the militia has managed to set up an operation inside of the Yellow Zone there, and he's been called in to oversee it. He's recently received a promotion from bomb maker to an active planner within the upper echelon by his ambush and subsequent execution of Needle and Cutter." The mood of the room turned somber, and Ferry took in a sharp breath. "For your information, Adam, those two were an integral part of this pod. The same ambush that Ferry barely escaped from. Well, let's just say they weren't so lucky. The bunk you spent last night and most of today in belonged to Cutter." She let out a heavy sigh and continued. "So, when I say the fact that you're sitting in this room means more than you understand, I mean it. Don't make me regret my decision." She took a moment to regain her focus and eyeballed the room. "His name is Vincent Ketter. He's ex-United States Marine Corps Special Operations, and he is currently one of the most dangerous men to the ladies serving down on the planet below." Sliding her finger on the omnipad, a satellite map of Cheyenne appeared on screen. "Here's how this is going to go down.